All right, good morning, everyone. Appreciate you taking time out of your day to spend some time with us on our first webinar. It's my first one, so bear with me. It might be a little bumpy. Couple of housekeeping items. So first of all, let's talk about the webinar itself. So really, this is about education today. It's really not a sales pitch. It's not trying to explain one way that's better than another. It's more about exposing all the different challenges and all the different decision points that you need to kind of consider. And so the webinar is actually being recorded so we could use it for future training. And really the whole idea of this came out of a discussion or several discussions that I had with Josh Luthman with Imagine Networks in Ohio. Josh and I worked together on a project starting almost a year ago this time and constructed through the fall, and now he's in the phases of turning up the customers and dealing with some of the post-build things, which really those were the things that sort of triggered my thinking on, I wonder if people had even thought about some of these things that happen after the build is done. So let's see if I go through the list. Yeah, really it's a high-level overview based on our experiences. We recommend that you take in the info and really look for the one or two ahas. I mean, most of this stuff people probably already know, but I'm hoping that there's one or two things on the list that maybe we didn't know. And really, again, it's not a how-to. It really can be a standalone session, or we may dive deep into the details that are of the most interest in a future session. So if somebody wants to talk about aerial versus buried, pros and cons, we could do a whole webinar on that, or active E versus GPON, or distributed split versus centralized split. And then please stay on mute if you can for the entire session. And if you have any questions, type them into the chat box. We'll get through as many as we can. We'll try to get triggered on which questions we need to do during the presentation, or we'll allow some time after the presentation as well. Okay, so let's start out with the big question, who should consider doing this? You know, we've worked with dozens of clients over the last years in a similar situation. And so what we found in talking with them is, you know, it's really about, do you want to defend your territory, or do you want to be proactive, or is there a reason to do an upgrade? And if you're going to do that upgrade, you know, should you go with fiber versus staying wirelessly? Is your approach really proactive or reactive? And so, Josh, maybe this would be a good time. We could talk about what drove you on your build. What were your thoughts on, you know, what questions you had, and then what you kind of made your decisions based on?
Sure. Yeah. So when we were looking at it, you know, I looked at fiber, you know, every one of the WISP shows, and just, you know, kind of really had the idea, and it seemed like it was impossible, it was out of reach and everything. Well, about this time last year at the show that didn't get canceled back in Cincinnati, I talked to a couple people at Millennium, and we just had a couple of conversations and just kind of got a feel for it. I feel like, you know, where we're at, we're in the really rural market, so WISP stuff there just kind of makes sense. But what about the stuff in town? We all know that the cable companies have a lot of love for them from their customers, so that's kind of what we wanted to go after. And it made no sense to do wireless there because we couldn't really compete on speed, and we just wanted to get something that was there and future-proof, you know, a long-term investment. So when we were looking at certain neighborhoods, we just had the geospatial guys kind of look at a couple neighborhoods and see what the costs were going to be. We don't want to be too small because you're going to jump in and you're going to get a long ROI at that point. And we don't want it to be too big because, you know, bank accounts are not unlimited. So kind of got one in the middle, and, you know, like you said, we're hooking up customers and everything, and everybody seems to be super happy and all that. You're going to have to go through a little bit more of a sales process versus people out in the rural community that don't have any options. But people find that, you know, with a better product, better customer service, cheaper price, everything, it's a pretty easy sale. You just have to make them aware of it. What really did it for me was just simply deciding to do it, and that was just the dollars and cents. You know, it's going to cost us much to get in. You know, once we pay that loan back, you know, we're just going to sit there and, you know, make money for the next, you know, 5, 10, 15 years, or however long it takes you to pay it back. So once it made business sense, that's when we just started signing contracts and getting people on board and ordering materials and moving forward.
Excellent. Thank you, Josh. So then really what? So what should you do? So obviously, there's no right way to do things. There are many options out there. Do you want the cheapest? Do you want the fastest? Do you want the best quality? Obviously, everyone wants all three, but those are hard to accomplish. But all of these factors play into how you want to proceed. And really, once you do a deep dive into those things and decide if really speed is my driver, then you got to think about materials and lead times. If you want the cheapest, then you got to think about what are the ramifications of that down the road? And if you want best quality, then you got to think, so it's sort of like whack-a-mole at the old fair. So you really need to kind of work through that. But once you get that, then you can start answering some of the questions here on the next slide, which is, do I want Active E or do I want GPON? I'm seeing mostly today is GPON. There are some folks that are doing Active E, and there were definitely folks doing Active E that have decided to just go to GPON. Again, just the options on if you're in GPON, do you want centralized split versus distributed split or indexing? There's pros and cons to any of those options or all of those options, and it just depends on how you kind of weigh that out. There's a lot of stuff that's pre-connectorized out there, so no splicing, but lead times and having a more specialized cable, which you might need, that plays into a little bit of that, but it offsets it by not having to have splicing out in the field. Just your material and your electronics vendors. There's a lot to choose from. There's a lot of stuff out there today. The big question we get is aerial versus buried. What are the pros and cons? Obviously make ready is a challenge, and it's as more and more people are building, it's really having an impact on the power companies, on the burden of finding space on the poles and then having to change out poles and do make ready, which again, if you're a power company, you're not getting compensated. You're getting compensated for the work, but it's not a revenue generating thing for you. So asking power companies to complete or commit a workforce to a project for another company to put cable up so that they can, bring in revenue, those don't make it very high on the list. So unless you own the poles or you're a joint owner or you have space on the poles today that you can lash a cable up, aerial can be challenging. And in addition to the cost of make ready, it's just the timing, the process to go through submitting an application, doing the pole loading if you have to, getting that information back, and then submitting a request. There's timing there. So if speed is your factor, typically speed and aerial isn't a very good combination, especially if you don't have strand on the pole today. Materials, a big discussion that we have now is materials. So do you want to control the materials in-house, or do you want to have the contractor supply the materials, or maybe some combination, which is mostly what I see. Maybe minor materials, not much of a concern, but if you're going to do the materials in-house, you need to consider things like lead times. Lead times, as we all know or should know, are way out right now. And so I'm starting to see 20, 24 weeks for some things, and it's almost July, so you can start to do the math. If you want to do something this fall, it's pretty tough. So having a good material provider or partner, and in the case of Josh's project, we had Millennium Supplier, who's our parent company, and then Geospatial and Josh, and between the three of us, we were able to make things work, and we could move things around, and it was super helpful. But in other cases, if you want the contractor to supply it, you got to consider they have costs as well. They've got markups, waste, shipping, getting the stuff to the job site. So the biggest thing I think if I think of materials being handled in-house versus having the contractor supply them, is waste, and I don't mean waste like careless. It's just normal waste on a project. If you have a project that's 10 miles and you order, 11 miles of interduct, depending on who owns or who's owning that material, there may be a different approach to how many tails are sticking out of the ground of that interduct and how much gets cut off. And so a contractor will build in a certain amount of waste, and they'll know they'll have that, and then they just, so they'll charge you a little more for the, let's say interduct is 35 cents. Maybe they'll charge you 40 cents because they need to buy an extra 2,000 feet of that because they know it's going to get, cut off and thrown away. So that's kind of a big deal. And then another big question we get is just the construction. Should I do the construction in-house or should I outsource? And so I think with more and more bigger projects out there, more and more people are considering, doing the construction themselves. It's a big leap, and it's certainly been done before, and I don't want to discourage it, but I believe it's a much bigger animal than maybe people realize. When you're dealing with, you have expensive equipment, you have to keep that equipment working, you have to maintain it. How big of a project do you have? What do you do with the next project? Dealing with OSHA, city requirements, permit requirements. There's some different things in there that might be easier to offset. But it has been done before and certainly can be. Some alternatives to this could be doing the splicing yourself or just doing the drops. It's doing some of the construction, some of the aspects and having some control over it, but not maybe taking on as much of the risks. All right. So then the next question is really like where, and Josh touched on this a little bit, like, each client we've talked to has had a different approach, but, some want to protect their current footprint. Some want to edge out. They're happy with the service in their footprint, but they want to get stuff on the edges. So understanding where to do it and what makes the most sense, is a big question and a big strategy that you should consider having defined before you start out. Do you want to just go small or big? Do you want to plant your flag, which is, you're going to do this? I see in the industry there's a lot of sort of flag planting going on where it's companies are saying, we're coming to your neighborhood, and they'll maybe do a small part of it. But that's hoping to stave off, some competition. And then maybe it takes a year or two to actually get that build done. Obviously, home density is a big deal, right? Because you got to build the plant. So the more homes you can stack together along that route. So if you got to build a mile of plant and you got 10 homes versus 20 homes, it's a much bigger deal. It makes the business case look better and your rate of return much faster. Take rates, that's another thing. Like maybe you start where you think you'll have a higher expected take rate, or wherever the highest take rates are, you start there first. Some challenges are, what's the proximity to the transport network? So do I got to build 5 miles to get to this area just to get in the game? Josh, I don't know if there's anything you want to add there. I kind of covered it, but I'll give you an opportunity.
Sure. Yeah, I would say, the biggest thing I look at it from a business sense is the take rate. You have no idea what that variable is. If you only get 1% take rate in the neighborhood, you're just going to, if you constructed all those homes, you're never going to make your money back, or at least not in your lifetime. Whereas if you get an 80% take rate or something like that, you might be, doing really, really good. There's no guarantee either which case. Maybe if you can market a little bit and sell it and all that before you actually do construction, that might be an option. In my case, I put a little bit of a feeler out. I had a handful of people sign up and go to the website. But in all honesty, out of those people that signed up and said I wanted it today, I think like 1 or 2 of them signed up. All the other people that we've hooked up at this point, we've just been doing, your standard sales stuff, door to door, that kind of thing. Obviously, you don't want to go too big into it, but you're going to be halfway decent size into it no matter how you look at it, just because of the cost of construction. But be aware of that. That's going to be your biggest variable, and it's unfortunately the hardest one to control.
And then, Josh, I remember we worked together on a door hanger that kind of did a combo of, hey, we're coming to your neighborhood, we're going to disrupt your yard. But then also, if you're interested, did you have any success with that? Are you happy with that, or was that?
Yeah, that's how we got those leads, was that door hanger.
Excellent.
On one hand, it was really good, but on the other hand, I kind of feel like it was semi-worthless. It's impossible really to say where along the lines. It didn't cost anything really to do. An afternoon and printed it out. I had hundreds of people say that they never saw it. We put it on their doors twice. I had pictures of every single one of them. Maybe these people are just ultimately that blind, or maybe they never used their front door. Maybe it was the door hanger wasn't built right and it just blew away. I don't know, but that is how we got those leads. And then, just the Facebook ad and, the general stuff too.
Yeah, I can just tell you, we've hanged thousands and thousands of door hangers, and that is the common theme. Never got it. So maybe they all blew away, or maybe they got it and thought it was, something else and didn't read it. But I would agree with you. There's a challenge. I do think that it's helpful to at least say you did it. And for the folks that read it, then they know, but it also can open you up to questions before you even started. So thank you. So then we could talk about when a little bit, right? So when is the right time? Is it now? Is it next year? Should I start thinking about it now for the fall? Obviously, there's a million factors that go into that. First of all, it's, financially, how do we make that work? Is it time to upgrade your network? Or do you have an upgrade coming? And sort of what Josh alluded to earlier, like if you're going to have to do an upgrade, do you just go to fiber then? Time of year, that's a big deal, right? So on the project Josh and I worked on, we constructed in the fall, and that was great. We got everything in before the end of the year. But then what happens in spring is then the grass comes up, or sometimes it doesn't come up, and the winter changed what happened in yards, and then you get sort of a whole flood of complaints on, you damaged my yard, and maybe it looked decent in the fall, but there wasn't enough time for the grass seed to germinate, and so then it washed away. And so the timing of the year, and again, you can go early season as well, but then if you go early, it's, the soil, depending on where you are in the country, in this case, we were in the Midwest, the soil is a little spongy in the spring, and so you can do a lot of damage, and you have that much more to clean up, on a day-to-day basis. And so these are pretty invasive projects. I mean, there's lots of people in the neighborhoods, there's lots of equipment, and you don't want to be there longer than you have to, and you don't want to leave. You want to minimize your mess. So time of the year definitely is something you should consider. Also, is there competition nearby? Like, do you see people coming into your area? Then that kind of feeds back into the offensive or defensive strategy. And then again, Josh kind of pointed this out, but looking to make a decision on an upgrade, is that you're going to invest in fiber, which most people say is a 20, 25-year investment, or do you invest back in the wireless, which may be, 5 years before something has to be done again. So, Josh, anything on that one, or I pretty much cover it?
Yeah, well, I do want to also make it clear that, the 5-year investment for one thing or 20-year for an investment, what we're actually coming from there is that the equipment should survive 20 years. It'll meet the customer's needs. It'll stay in the ground, and, customers will get on YouTube or whatever for 20 years. That's not how long it should take for you to pay it back.
Oh, yeah. Sorry about that.
Very big difference.
My point was it's an investment that lasts for 20 years, not it takes 20 years to pay it back. Yeah.
Yep, exactly. And it's not like fiber just disintegrates after 20 years. I mean, I'm fully expecting it to last, longer than that. But if you do need to replace that stuff, I mean, the glass in the ground, that can stay there for, probably as long as you live. The equipment's on either end. I mean, that's what, like a 15-minute change out or something like that. It's completely different than, than wireless and maybe some other technologies and stuff. But as long as that glass is in the ground, that's your real true asset, and that'll be there for a good long time.
Yeah, totally agree. And I think I first started in this business in the late 90s. So we've got stuff that's over 20 years and still going strong. So thank you.
Yep.
Then we can talk about why, which we kind of covered different facets of this, but, why should we do it? Does the business case make sense? Economics, rate of return. I think Josh did cover most of that. Is there funding available? There's a lot of funding options out there. And if there's a positive that can come out of the COVID situation, it's that maybe it shined a light that there isn't enough broadband, or the broadband we thought we had isn't there. So it's generating a lot of interest and a lot of funding at the state and federal level. There's a big RDOF auction, I think, this fall, and then there's also there's other funding that's available. So maybe that's a way to incent people to look at this as well. And is it is your presence in your community a long-term goal? Do you want to stay there versus having somebody come in and nudge you out? And then just a few other things. We kind of touched on the grants and loans, what's available out there, the timing, signups. Josh talked about this a little bit. Like, do you try to get pre-sales, or do you try to get people to sign up in advance to see what your momentum is? Sometimes it works, sometimes it doesn't. Marketing, again, we touched on this with how do you announce what you're going to do? Do you hang door hangers and let people know? What about project management? You hired the contractor, you got the engineering done, you got the contract in place. Now let's just build it. It's pretty straightforward, but then there's a lot of things which we'll talk about in the next slide. And one of the biggest ones, and I'm sure Josh, you would agree, is just the customer complaint management. And maybe not even necessarily complaints, but questions or concerns. And so, you damaged my flowers, or when are you going to get me service, or what, there's a lot of that happens, and it's much bigger than people realize. So while you may not need project management, you may need some form of, sort of funneling the calls or dealing with the changes. So
absolutely.
So that kind of puts us to the last big slide, these were really kind of our ahas in all of this. Really, and I'm going to call them the intangibles, but there's always something, right? Any project, doesn't matter if you're putting a 10 by 10 deck on the back of your house, you're going to run into an outlet or a spigot or something that's going to cause you to have to change your plans or to amend your plans. And building a network in a neighborhood, whether that's 50 homes or 500 homes, you're going to run into stuff. So there's always stuff that you didn't think would be a problem, but it is, and your stuff that you thought would be challenging and end up not being as challenging. But one of the big things is the contracts, right? So we all have contracts and we all deal with contracts, but having a contract in place with your construction company, if you're outsourcing that, making sure that that contract does what it's intended to do. I would suggest having some form of a warranty on there, whether it's for 1 year, because one of the things that happens is not everything is located and you don't often find out about things. And in my over 20 years of doing this, there's lots of sanitary laterals that get hit that typically aren't located, and you don't find out about them until 8 months after the fact. And so if you don't have anything to help you with that, or just warranty on the placement, if a handhole you set in the sidewalk heaves up and it's sticking out 2 inches out of the ground because of frost or whatever, you're either going to have to pay for that or bring somebody back in to do that for you. Retainage, this is another good question. So keeping a small percentage of the contract amount as sort of a retainage. So like if you build your project in the fall, you keep 5 or 10% of the contract amount, and then you pay that when the cleanup has kind of been signed off by by you or the permitting authority or whomever. There's another thing in there that I see a lot in contracts. It's not often used, but it's liquidated damages, which is like you have a set deadline and you want this done by, let's say, August 1st, and it doesn't happen by August 1st. There's a way you can put something in there that's like a late penalty that can help you. Just, again, something for you to consider. Permits, sometimes it's not a big deal. And in the case of the project that Josh and I worked on, it wasn't a big deal, but in other areas, if you have railroads that you have to cross or certain fees per sheet, per road crossing, there's liabilities and indemnification in some of these permits that are actually like contracts. If you cross a railroad, there's different things in there. So be aware of what those are and make sure you have somebody read those and understand. I mean, if I know in my past on some railroad projects, if you're crossing the railroad or if you're attached to a pole and let's say somebody hits the pole, you happen to be on the pole, somehow there was some liability for us as the network owner because we were attached to that pole. We had some involvement in that. So understanding the nuances to some of that stuff is helpful. Established yards versus, getting in a new subdivision where it's brownfield versus greenfield. Established yards is a challenge. I'm sure Josh can attest to this. This was probably maybe the biggest thing that was, that sort of caught us was just how much of a nuisance that can be. And if you're drilling, you're minimizing that versus, other methods. But even there, you still have your drill pits, you still have your locates and where you potholed and where you're setting the pads. So it's still disruptive. Just concrete driveways. And in our case, we had the gas was put in before the driveways, and then now the gas was over the driveways. So you got to basically expose the gas. So just things like that to keep an eye on. Obviously, cleanup and restoration, big deal. It's always a big deal. Everyone talks about it, no matter how much you harp about it, it's a big deal. And so it's something that needs to be addressed and expectations set. And even then, there's still quite a bit of hand-holding that goes on with that piece. Take rates. We talked about take rates. Really drops in splicing. Like, how do you keep track of that, right? So let's say you launch a 150 lot subdivision and you get 30 drops. How do you keep track of who called in locates, who's got service, who did the drop get placed, do I need the drops, the materials themselves, who's going to do the splicing? There's a whole big thing that happens. I think a lot of folks want to think that, once the build is done, you're kind of done, and then you just hook up the customers. Well, the drop work, could potentially be as much work, if not more, than the actual build, depending on your take rate and the timing of it. And getting flooded with a lot and how you keep track of all that, that can be a menace as well. And then just like your as-built and records going forward, how are you going to keep track of your records? What are you going to give to the locating company so they locate your plant? Things like that. You need to think about what your long-term plan for those records are. And then really ongoing maintenance and outages. If somebody hits your cable, do you have a contractor that can come in and fix that outage? And if you damage the fiber or something, do you have fiber on hand? Do you have materials on hand to be able to do that repair? If not, it could be a pretty sticky situation. And then the last thing, and I'm sure Josh would also agree with me on this, the impact of social media on builds, whether it's positive or negative. So obviously, positive is somebody can say, hey, these guys came in, did a great job, my yard's great, I have their service, I love it. And they might, then 10 people might read that, but the opposite could also happen. These guys came in and tore up my yard, and they could take a picture and post it, and it can work against you. So that's, I would say in the last 5 years, that's been one of the biggest changes from my perspective in the industry, is people's ability to impact the build. And it doesn't take very long. One crew member can disrupt the whole thing. And even if you have everything covered, they could take a picture of something. And sometimes people post and it's not even, it's not even the construction that you're doing, right? It's somebody else, but you get lumped in there because you were there the week before. So it's definitely a challenge. And Josh, I don't know if there's anything you want to add to that. I'm sure that probably gave you more headaches than anything.
Sure. I mean, I don't know what version of Facebook you're using where you see positive posts. I would like to use that one, but I don't see any of the positive. I mean, it's, there's a handful of Facebook warriors on there that complain that we were tearing up yards, and they said they would never, ever sign up for service and all this other stuff. And then, of course, those are the ones that actually signed up because, our plans were faster and cheaper. But did they say anything back and update that post? No, they just sit there and said that they destroyed their yard and whatever. And at the end of the day, it's great that we have that customer, but I feel like any post that goes on any of that stuff is exclusively bad. And a weight of one negative post is going to be way more than 100 positive posts. And of course, it's actually the other way around. You see 100 negative posts for every one positive, but nobody cares about any of the positive stuff. So my suggestion is probably just to, if you're going to post something on Facebook, don't let people comment, because no matter what you do, it's never going to fare well. Once you have your service active and, your speeds are up there and you got people with speed tests and stuff, that's a different story. That's probably where I would say that, posting those good speeds and all that will actually probably get you some positive feedback.
Excellent. Thank you, Josh, for the insight. So I guess that kind of gets us to the end. So I guess what we were hoping to accomplish is maybe shed some light on a couple of things you hadn't thought about, or reinforce things you had. You had some real life experiences. We have an actual WISP who's lived this and is living it. We've got representation from CommScope in support of that. They were the company that actually provided the materials for us. There's folks from Millennium who handled the logistics for us. And of course, obviously, Geospatial. I'm going to say thanks to everyone that attended. I'm looking into the chat. Did we have any questions, or are there any questions now?
There have been some feedback about the great information on the slides, and if there will be anything sent out so that people have like a hard copy of the information. So maybe mention the checklist we've put together.
Oh, yeah. Okay, perfect. Thank you. Yeah, so what we did was, rather than to give you the presentation, we have a checklist that kind of has the bullets and the items here that you may be interested in. And we'll send that out on Monday. And do you just get it if you signed up, or do you have to request it, Jess? I don't know.
Yeah, that's a great question. It will go out to everybody that registered. So a good chunk of the registrants are live on the session, but even if people didn't make it and they're going to rely on the recording, everybody is going to receive the checklist. It will go out on Monday so that you're getting it on a business day. We just want to have some time to edit or not edit necessarily, but trim the audio so that we just have the content of the webinar in there. So that stuff will go out to everybody on Monday.
Excellent. Josh, anything else you want to add?
I mean, if anybody has questions on this stuff, we did set aside a few minutes to answer questions here and now. But of course, if you have to go or whatever, then you're more than welcome to reach out to, at least Kevin and myself. I can't speak to Brad. I don't know. I would assume Brad, as a sales guy, is open to questions and stuff anytime. But you're more than welcome to ask anytime down the road. If you have any sort of, how did you do this, or why did you do this? Can you give me your exact situation, your exact scenario, and and stuff like that, I'd be more than happy to help anybody else, because almost everything that I learned in the last 12 months, I was asking those exact same questions, just the right people, and that's got me to the point where, I've got a fully functional plant and, hooking up customers.
Excellent. Jess, any questions then, or should we wrap it up?
Just have a couple more things. Josh, there's interest around just kind of being proactive with the social media aspect of it. And I love that you called out that when you make your posts that shed light on your project, not allowing the comments, that's probably a proactive way to manage the feedback that you can get on social media. Are there any other tips with that? Because it is so, it's a real vulnerable place, social media, because everybody can just put out what they put out. So any other tips on that piece? I know you mentioned a little earlier, you did a little bit of Facebook ads and stuff like that. So would you recommend that piece as a marketing piece for getting these projects, getting customers and so forth and managing?
Yeah, I mean, what they say is there's no such thing as bad publicity. I mean, except for maybe on Facebook. But if you just have pictures of, the internet speeds and, whatever all else going on, just the fact that you're there, just to make people aware of you, because, everybody's aware of Time Warner Cable, Charter, Comcast, all these other names. But when you're just this, reasonably small company that's coming in with fiber or internet or whatever, people really only know you through, I mean, obviously a little bit of word of mouth, and while that's powerful, that's not really going to get you any sort of numbers. Going door to door has done way more sales than anything else. Facebook ads, I mean, if you put an ad up there, just make people aware of it and limit it to the area where you've built. And even if you expand out a little bit, worst case scenario is you got an extra lead, and it didn't really cost you anything. Facebook ads are by far the most cost-effective tool out there. I mean, it's a fraction of what we paid for door hangers, and it's gotten, I mean, I would say probably 10 or 100 times as much leads and value and everything out of it. It's very good to be able to target. People just pay attention way more of Facebook ads than they do the yet another door hanger or yet another flyer in the mailbox. I mean, I'm sure I'm not the only one here that just sees this stuff and just throw it away. I just got my new driver's license today, and I was 2 seconds away from throwing it out because I thought it was just a spam thing from Time Warner Cable. It was a good thing I opened it up because obviously it wasn't. And, 90% of the stuff that's in the mailbox, or even 99% of the stuff that's in the mailbox, is all spam and garbage and trash. It's that 1% that, people shouldn't throw away, but of course they do. So Facebook ads are, like I said, just far more valuable. I mean, it'll cost maybe a little bit. I mean, it's not that expensive, but it's the percent that you get back that's really, really valuable.
Anything else, Jess?
That is going to do it for questions at this time. I like that you put together this slide with your contact info, because my guess is as people digest the info, more questions will come up.
Excellent. Thanks to everyone for joining. Thank you, Josh, very much for being a participant. And hopefully this was worth everyone's time, and have a great day and have a nice weekend. Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.